Good afternoon and welcome to the Literaturhaus Berlin online. My name is Sonja Longolius and I'm one of the directors of the Literaturhaus. Today we are very proud and joyful to start a new cooperation between the Stiftung Bauhaus Dessau and the Literaturhaus Berlin. And not even the coronavirus can keep us from doing so, because luckily we have very brave and adventurous authors who embark on a digital journey with us to celebrate literature also in these difficult times. Haus Gropius Fiktional is the title of our series that the Stiftung Bauhaus Dessau and the Literaturhaus Berlin developed to bring together authors and artists in joint residencies at the Masterhäuser in Dessau. These Tandem-Residences are meant to revitalize and foster the exchange between art and literature that had thrived already at the Bauhaus in the 1920s. I would like to thank Florian Strob and his team from the Stiftung Bauhaus Dessau for this wonderful initiative. Thank you very much. We are very happy that we were able to start this exchange with two fabulous artists. Visual artist Inge Mahn and poet and translator Sujata Bhatt. Certainly, their tandem residency has become a great challenge due to the current pandemic, but they decided to carry on nevertheless and continue their work and dialogue. So please stay tuned and follow their mutual work over the summer. Now, I'm very happy to welcome Sujata Bhatt, who will talk to Florian Strob from the Stiftung Bauhaus Dessau about her work and her residency in times of Corona. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Sonja, for your lovely introduction, and thank you to the whole Literaturhaus team for making this event possible despite Corona. So I would like to start also with a few sentences about the residency program. In the 1920s, the artists of the international Avantgarde, so Paul Klee, Wassily Kandinsky, Annie Albers, you name them, lived next door to one another in these so-called Masterhäuser in Dessau. When the Bauhaus closed its doors in Dessau in 1932, due to pressure from the National Socialists, artists left the houses too. In 2016, so more than 80 years later, contemporary artists returned to the scene. Today, the Bauhaus residency enables artists from all over the world to live and work in the Masterhäuser. And since the beginning of this year, one of the aims, as Sonja explained, of the redesigned residency program is to bring together artists and writers. This is also due to the fact that writing and publishing played an essential role in the historic Bauhaus. And our very first writer in residence is the poet Sujata Bhatt. Now, thanks to the coronavirus, we had to change our initial plans for this year. Instead of a brown bag lunch, we're recording this lovely tea time conversation, and we actually had to interrupt the residencies quite abruptly 2.5 weeks ago. Meaning that our artist in residence, the German sculptor Inge Mahn, and Sujata Bhatt are now back home and will hopefully be able to return to Dessau very soon, maybe already in June, who knows. The plan, as much as hope, is right now that we will be able to open the exhibit of Inge Mahn and Sujata Bhatt at the end of June. We'll see whether that works. But now, it is my great pleasure to introduce Sujata Bhatt for those of you who don't know her yet. She was born in Ahmedabad, India, and grew up in Pune, India, and in the United States. She received her MFA from the Writers' Workshop at the University of Iowa, and to date she has published 9 collections of poetry with Carcanet Press in the United Kingdom. She received the Commonwealth Poetry Prize and the Alice Hunt Bartlett Award for her first collection, Brunizem, published in 1988. Subsequent collections include, for example, The Stinking Rose, shortlisted for the Forward Poetry Prize in 1995, A Color for Solitude, 2002, Pure Lizard, also shortlisted for the Forward Poetry Prize in 2008, and Collected Poems, PBS Special Commendation in 2013, and most recently, I should mention Poppies in Translation, published in 2015. She received the Chomley Award in 1991, the Italian Tratti Poetry Prize in 2000, and the German Literature Award Das Neue Buch in 2008. In 2014, she was the first recipient of the Mexican International Poetry Prize, Premio Internacional de Poesía Nuevo Siglo de Oro, 1914 to 2014. Excuse my Spanish there, I don't actually speak Spanish, but at least I try. She has translated poetry from Gujarati, her mother tongue, and German into English. She has been a Lansdowne visiting writer at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, a visiting fellow at Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, and more recently was poet in residence at the Poetry Archive in London and at the Heinrich Böll Cottage in Ireland. Her work has been widely anthologized, broadcast on radio and television, and has been translated into more than 20 languages. Finally, I would like to mention that the German publishing company Hansa just published Die Stinkrose, a volume of Sujata's poems, finally, I have to say, translated into German by the poet Jan Wagner. So, Sujata, after listening to this quite wonderful biography of yours, when I first encountered your work, it was really, despite this biography, by chance, believe it or not. I left the library building at the University of Oxford, and there was a stack of books in front of the door to give away. I browsed through it and picked up the volume A Color for Solitude. It's basically a cycle of poems working through the life and works of the modernist painter Paula Modersohn-Becker and her friendship with the poet Rainer Maria Rilke and his wife, the sculptor Clara Rilke-Westhoff. I was very surprised that I hadn't heard of you before. Also, there seemed to be hardly any translations of your work into German. It still strikes me as something rather bewildering today, because there are so many links to German literature and culture in your poems. For how long, Sujata, have you lived in Germany, and what brought you to the city of Bremen?
Okay. Let's see. Well, I've been living here for many years, and I suppose what brought me to Bremen was a personal reason rather than a professional reason. I met my future husband when I was a student at Iowa, and as it turned out, we decided that we wanted to stay together, and that's how I ended up in Bremen. Yes, go on.
Well, Bremen now is, funnily enough, very close to Worpswede, right? Which is where actually Rainer Maria Rilke, Paula Modersohn-Becker, and Clara Rilke-Westhoff lived together more or less for a while. And in your volume, A Color for Solitude, that plays the village, I suppose, of Worpswede plays a prominent role. But you had discovered Rilke before you moved to Bremen, right?
Yes, that's right. Like many students of literature, I had, of course, read Rilke in English translation, and I was naturally curious about his life, and I was interested in it, like many other people have been and continue to be. And so, as I was telling you the other day, the very first poem I wrote about this theme of the three artists and their work as well as their friendship is the poem No Road Leads to This, which is in the volume A Color for Solitude. And at that time, I was about 20 when I wrote it, and I had never been to Germany. And so I just imagined the landscape in Worpswede and in Westerwede, where the poem is set. And so, of course, when I came to Bremen and when I visited Worpswede for the first time, it was very exciting for me. And I should also say that while writing these poems, I had many years of research, which I didn't see as research. It was just my own interest in viewing the works of Paula Modersohn-Becker and Clara Westhoff, and it was just also my interest in reading more of Rilke's works and becoming better acquainted with his place in German literary history. And I also had the good fortune to meet Paula Modersohn-Becker's daughter, as well as her grandniece, and that added another dimension to my work.
So you've published that book, I believe, in 2002, right? But that
That's
means
right.
You've actually worked on these poems for decades, I could say. And I think if I also saw that correctly in your most recent collection, Poppies in Translation, there's another poem about Rilke. So you seem to keep working on this friendship and on these people. Is that correct?
Yes, and like all of my poems, they are not they're not in a way, they're not imagined. No, how can I say it? It's not that I sit down and I say, okay, today I'm going to write such and such poem. What I end up writing frequently comes as a surprise to myself. A poem usually begins with one line, and sometimes it leads somewhere and sometimes it doesn't. So yes, these historical figures, these and writers have not left my imagination, so to speak. But in the actual writing of the book, A Color for Solitude, took a year. But the research and the books and experiences I had beforehand happened for decades. So I was doing research without calling it research, and it was at a certain point. That's right. And though, of course, while I was writing the book, then of course I did further research, so to speak. But the writing came very quickly. It just flowed, and every day I was writing a lot, and I was just thinking that, in fact, one thing that interrupted a poem was I was writing, and my mother telephoned me. But oh yes, beforehand, friends told me what was going on, and first I didn't believe it, and then I was shocked. But in my notebook, I always write by hand first. In the notebook, you can see the pause, and then I go back, or perhaps it's only me. I'm the one who knows what happened and where I stopped, and then I went back. But this is just to illustrate I suppose the total absorption I experienced while writing the book.
And I think as a reader, you can tell, you read that book and you basically read it cover to cover, I think, at least I did, and you get a sense of that flow I think you were talking about, the flowing of the words, the rhythm, the rhythms, maybe plural, but, you know, they are consistent, I think, through the book. So I think we should give our listeners a chance to hear some of the poems, right?
Yes, thank you.
So could we please listen to the 3 poems from A Color for Solitude?
Self-portrait done with red chalk, 1897. You are Italian now, Renaissance sadness in your eyes, seriousness of the very young, and red chalk your only color, except for a few black shadows, spidery in your hair, a few black strokes strong enough to cut the neckline of your dress. You have made yourself Italian, your face smaller, narrower, red chalk coloring your concentration, your deep attention, a pigment Fayum painters used only for the skin of men, for the darker skin of men who worked outdoors. But you do not know that, not yet. No road leads to this. Clara Westhoff to Rainer Maria Rilke, 1901, Westerwede. No road leads to this old house we chose, its roof of straw scattered by the loud wind wheezing its North Sea sounds. No road leads to this old house we chose. I live downstairs with my clay and stones, you upstairs with ink and paper. What do we do but play with truth, a doll whose face I must rework again and again until it is human? The clay has gathered all the warmth from my hands. I am too cold to touch the marble yet. Last night the wind blew my candle out. Tonight again on the staircase I grope my way to your room. Each night I climb up these steps back to you with your open windows, so close to the wind and stars. I listen to your poems as I wash the dust off my skin and hair. You must have the windows open all night. I must watch the straw from the roof slowly swirl, fall inside, and gently cover your poems. Tomorrow, come downstairs, will you? It has been a month. I want to show you the new stone I found, stuck in the mud by the dead tree. Such a smooth globe, not quite white, but honeydew, with a single dark green vein curled across. Come downstairs, will you? See the bright red leaves I stole from the woods. See my lopsided clay figure bow low down before my untouched marble. Tomorrow, Come see the ground, the gawky yellow weeds at eye level from my window down below. Two girls, two sisters. Paula Becker to Clara Westhoff, 1900. Two girls, two sisters. That's what Rilke calls us, celebrating us, and he would join our sisterhood. If only we could remain like this, Clara, open in our love without having to choose.
Thank you, Sujata, for these beautiful readings of your poems, of 3 of the poems from A Color for Solitude. Could you tell us a little bit more about the background of these poems? Because in your preface to the cycle, you mentioned Clara's presence in the works of her husband, Rainer Maria Rilke, as well as her silence. You wanted to break that silence, you said. It seems to me there's a lot to be said about the problematic and at the same time quite productive connection between a female voice and silence in literature. What is your take on this?
I think, yes. With the silence, for example, or to put it in another way, you will notice that, or the reader will notice that I never speak in the voice of Rilke, because that would be ridiculous. Rilke spoke for himself, and he spoke extensively for himself. But Clara Westhoff and Paula Becker wrote comparatively little, and so I could imagine what they might have said if they had said something, or I could try to imagine what they would have thought. One knows what Rilke thought about many things through his journals and his letters, as well as his poems. And so for me, that is one way of inspiration, to imagine what someone who didn't say very much, if they had been given a chance to speak, what would they have said?
Yeah, you're giving them a voice, really, but do you see that also as a political act, maybe a sort of feminist work? Because in that poem we just listened to, Self-Portrait Done with Red Chalk, there is this beautiful line, a pigment Fayum painters used only for the skin of men. But here Paula Modersohn Becker uses it for her self-portrait, right?
Yes, I think when I write, if there is any nuance or dimension, or a feminist dimension, it tends to come out in an unconscious or subtle manner, or I didn't set out to write it like that. And also, as I started, I was looking at her drawing and the colors, and then it was the information I knew about the Fayum painters which entered the poem. But I don't think that Paula herself saw that in those stark feminist terms. Of course, she was a strong woman, and she was determined to fight for her freedom to create art. So in that sense, she was a feminist in a very natural way.
And because it is so natural, I think, and so subtle, it probably works all the better, right? I mean, it's not, as you said, the first thing you think about, but then it comes so naturally. And at least for me as a reader, that message then was so much stronger because of it. Maybe that.
Oh,
that
thank you.
There's another earlier poem of yours that I wanted to briefly talk about because it is probably among your most famous poems. It's called Search for My Tongue. And there silence comes up quite prominently too. But here you point at the many passages and forms of translations that are part of life in general, I guess, but particularly so of yours. In the poem, the narrator seems to struggle fundamentally with the task of translating. Quote, I can't speak, I speak nothing, nothing, unquote, and yet succeeds impressively by inhabiting a space in between different languages, it seems to me at least. The poem itself consists of passages in English and your mother tongue, Gujarati. In yet another poem that is also included in Die Stinkrose, you not only use German words, but even quote from Plattdeutsch, Low German, a West Germanic language spoken mainly in northern Germany, a language that my grandmothers spoke when they talked to each other. So what is the role of translation and the process of translating for you in your work as well as in your life? And I don't know, of course, because of the crazy political times we're living through at the moment, there seemed to be some sort of, not political message maybe, but there seems to be a political aspect, let's say, at least to this as well.
For the languages and translation.
The different languages, translation, yeah, borders.
Yes, exactly. Well, yes, as you all know, well, my listeners included, it was through British colonialism that people in India became, through Britain, people in India became acquainted with the English language. It was a colonial, it was part colonial experience, and but to go beyond that, if I think of the places where I have lived and where I live now in Bremen, then of course I'm always confronted with other languages, and in a way, in my childhood, because it was also a nomadic childhood, English became my language in the end. But I am interested in other languages, and in my research, I do read other languages. I read a lot of German, and I do read literature in Gujarati, and of course I work always in English, so I might experience things in other languages, for example in German or in Gujarati, but in the end I, as you observed, translate it into English. So not only is the experience translated as an experience, but also the language it occurred in becomes translated. So I suppose a certain level of translation is a constant part of my life, but I don't really think about it that much. I know there are times when I'm reading many different texts. I tend to read several books at the same time. Sometimes I might forget exactly which language I read it in, but I'll remember the content or in what it was about. But of course, this doesn't happen all the time. I know which language I read it in, but when the text is so good and when it makes a deep impression on me, I don't really think of the language itself that it's written in, but what the text is saying or describing, or also the musicality of it. So, for example, the Plattdeutsch that you mentioned, I have met Plattdeutsch writers over here in Bremen, and I have used old documents written in Plattdeutsch, especially when I was working on one of my poems called "The Hole in the Wind," which deals with storms that happened on the island of Juist. Language. I don't know. It's something that has always interested me. I'm also very much interested in the etymology of words, and sometimes what I read and what I discover leads to a poem, and so that's how it enters my work.
Before we talk more about your discoveries in Dessau, I think we should give the listeners who are listening to this in Germany at least a brief chance to hear more about the German volume of your poetry that just came out. So could you tell us a little bit about that? Because I know you speak German quite well and you read German, as you said, and your German husband is a writer too. Did this make things easier or add more difficulties to the already difficult business of translating poetry when you put together Die Stinkrose for German readers?
I didn't understand, that did all this make it more difficult for me to compile the poems?
Yeah, because you have so much knowledge about the literature and the culture that your texts are translated into, and already within these texts there are so many links to that culture, although there hadn't been a lot of translations, unfortunately, of your work into German so far. I guess that's what I was wondering about.
Oh, okay. No, I think I was very happy when I realized that Jan Wagner was interested in translating my work, and I can't thank him enough for the tremendous job that he has done. I know it's very, very difficult to translate my work into any language because frequently I have a tone which is in between, or certain emotional tones are, I think, difficult to get into German. But all translation is challenging and difficult. And
it is, yeah.
So I am full of admiration for the work that Jan Wagner has done with the poems, the way he has translated them, the solutions he has found. It's like a dream come true. This book come out with Hansa Verlag, and to have such a wonderful poet, Jan Wagner, as the translator of my work.
So we can only tell everyone to get this volume of poetry of yours in Germany, finally in German. And I think we should listen to a couple of poems from this volume, because it gives everyone a pretty good overview of your work so far. It's a selection from all of your collections that you've published until now. So please, could we listen to the second block of poems?
A different history. Great Pan is not dead. He simply emigrated to India. Here the gods roam freely, disguised as snakes or monkeys. Every tree is sacred, and it is a sin to be rude to a book. It is a sin to shove a book aside with your foot, a sin to slam books down hard on a table, a sin to toss one carelessly across the room. You must learn how to turn the pages gently, without disturbing Saraswati, without offending the tree from whose wood the paper was made. 2. Which language has not been the oppressor's tongue? Which language truly meant to murder someone? And how does it happen that after the torture, after the soul has been cropped, with a long scythe swooping out of the conqueror's face, the unborn grandchildren grow to love that strange language? What is exotic? For Hasso Kroll. Sweden is exotic, and so is all of Finland. Whortleberries certainly are. Estonia is exotic, and so is the Estonian word for lizard, sisalik. But the lizard herself is my sister, those hot afternoons when she comes indoors to hide. 1980. It was the year of the monkey. The Green Party was founded in West Germany. Jean-Paul Sartre died, and the next day my friend Mary said, "I wonder how Sartre feels now, because now he knows that God exists after all." The people of India voted for Indira Gandhi. The people of America voted for Ronald Reagan. And then John Lennon died. It was the year of the monkey. Weren't French. If I weren't French, I'd love to be English. In England, one has to carry on, despite all the odds. England expects every man, woman, and child to do their duty. Are you strong enough to be English? Of course I am. However, I am French, and therefore do not need to be English. I would only want to be English if I weren't French. How about being Scottish or Welsh or Irish or even Japanese? Japan is a fine country. And how about being German? Do you mean to say that you would rather be English than German? I am French, so I have nothing to fear. But if I weren't French, then I would truly love to be English. What can you tell us? Now that you have learned our language, what can you tell us? Winter is over. I found my son asleep under a tree. We danced through the night. I know you won't believe me unless you see it for yourself. Before you cross the next border, you must answer the following questions. Is anyone there to receive you? Who loves you? What do your friends say? Where will you keep your books? I have seen horses slide through sunrise, through moonrise, horses in spring wild. They look through your being and find nothing to hold them back. Someone waits for me, someone I have never met before. Does that make him a stranger? Yes, we have exchanged letters. My love is anonymous. My friends are deaf and mute. I look into their eyes, their clear, truthful eyes. I have lost all my books in the flood. If you decide to live among us, you must observe the following rules. Speak clearly, be quiet, enjoy life, die at the right time. Now that we have accepted you, do you have any further wishes? Long live the king. I'd really like a glass of water. God be with us, if only he were here.
Thank you, Sujata, again for these poems. And kind of the first thing that immediately comes to mind now thinking about Dessau is how exotic is Dessau for you, or was Dessau for you? Because in the poems you chose for today, you bring up a lot of themes, right? Difference, the other, the exotic, memory, to only name a few. What binds all of them together is maybe something of a global view or a globally connecting view at very specific moments in time. 1980, for example, we've heard that. Connecting specific places and situations. In German, I would probably say something like weltgewandt, worldly, or even better, dem Leben zugewandt, lifeward, with all senses. So I would maybe rephrase my question, what is exotic for you in Dessau, or how exotic is Dessau for you, by saying, or asking, what were your first associations and memories when you started your residency in Dessau that unfortunately was interrupted now by the coronavirus?
Oh, okay. Well, before I arrived in Dessau, I had read quite a bit about the history of the place and about Gropius, about the other artists, architects, painters, photographers, metal workers who lived and worked there, and the students. So it felt like as living in one of the master's houses, the Mucha house. It felt like going back in time to a certain to those at least mentally, and since it's a historical building, it has been preserved, so it doesn't meet all the standards of today's buildings, so one could really experience firsthand how it felt perhaps to live there in those days. But in those days it was very modern. So I found it very, very interesting, and yes, exotic, something I had never experienced before in that way. And I should say, yes, the poems that I just read, they covered some of the things we spoke about earlier, language, different cultures and countries. And I wanted to also say that I have such a wide range of topics in my works, or each book is different. So even a selected poem such as Die Stinkrose that Hansa brought out, a dual language edition, there's a lot that's missing. But to go back to Dessau and the Bauhaus, one thing I noticed were the doors and the rooms, and then the multiple doors. For example, in the bathroom, there were 3 doors, one leading to the hallway and the other 2 into 2 different bedrooms. And so that was interesting and funny sometimes, because it took a few days for me to orient myself and to know where all the rooms are. I was constantly getting lost in this maze of rooms and doors.
Yeah,
and,
it's quite an odd setup.
That's right. And one thing I should mention, we were speaking about this earlier. Again, when I was very young, because of my life between India and the United States, I was very aware of the different architectures in those countries, obviously, and the fact that the India I grew up in, there was a certain openness where we lived. The doors, I felt, were always open, metaphorically and also literally. And in North America, of course, because of the climate, things have to be kept closed. And when I was about 20, I had written a poem called "The Doors Are Always Open," where in the poem I speak more about what is happening outside instead of focusing on the doors. But now, thinking of Dessau and the Mucha House, I think I would like to write something more about the many doors in that particular house, and in all of the other masters' houses as well. And also I was thinking about life indoors and life outdoors. So another poem which we will listen to shortly, called "Hey," refers to that a little bit. And whether one sees many people in a city or a town, or whether everyone is indoors, has also to do with climate many times. And one other thing I wanted to say about the Bauhaus, as you know, it's set in a grove of pine trees.
Yes.
and pine trees remind me of New England, because that's where I had first encountered them in my life. And that's part of the reason I include the poem Eurydice Speaks, which would be the last poem that we listen to. But in that, it's an ode to Maine and the natural landscape in Maine. And one thing I especially liked was sitting in the atelier in the Mucha house and looking at the pine trees and watching them move in the wind and watching the light, how it moved during the day. And as you know, the atelier faces north, and that's another theme I'm interested in: light. The way two bedrooms face east, one bedroom faces west, but the atelier faces north, so one never has direct sunlight, which I suppose would be disruptive, because then one, as an artist, one would feel blinded by the light.
Yeah, I mean, they were built for artists, right, to paint in these studios. And the pine trees, by the way, are an integral part of the whole design of these buildings, and are actually protected as well as the houses, and are part of the World Heritage Site of the Masters houses. So they really belong together. Just something I wanted to briefly mention before we listen to these three poems you mentioned from your earlier work that you thought of while being in Dessau is that, of course, there were several reasons why we asked you and Inge Mahn to come participate in our new residency program with the Literaturhaus Berlin, and that is you both work with narratives and memories. And so Inge Mahn, who's a sculptor, actually also started her ideas for the upcoming exhibit of the two of you by looking at the doors of her master's house, the Schlemmer house, just next door to yours. And she had this idea or this image in her head of the contradicting doors, so the doors that are contradicting each other, because there are so many doors, as you mentioned, for example, in the bathroom, which was supposed to be super functional, but today it strikes us probably as a little odd. But let's listen to the three poems before we say a few more words about the upcoming exhibit.
The doors are always open. Everywhere you turn there are goats, some black and lumpy, others with oily mushroom soft hair, sticky yellow in Muslim sand, shaded by the mosque. Next door there's a kerosene-smeared kitchen. We share a window with the woman who lives with goats. Now she unwraps some cheese. Now she beats and kneads a little boy and screams, "Idiot, don't you tease that pregnant goat again." I look away. Outside, the rooster runs away from his dangling sliced head, while the pregnant goat lies with mourning hens. Her bleating consolations make the children spill cheesy milk and run outside. Wet soccer ball bubbles roll out from a hole beneath the lifted tail. The goat licks her kids free, pushing, pushing, until they all wobble about. We've counted 5, hopping up and down. We push each other until we see the goat pushing her kids to stand up, until mothers call us back to thick milk. Hey, your photographs of Indian temples are incomplete. Where's that man I saw every day, laughing at the clean Brahmin's children who were afraid of him? Where's that man with the swollen elephant leg, who sits by the pillar, crawling with gods and flies? Eurydice speaks. Orpheus, I tell you, I'm not in hell. This place is called Maine. All winter the cold wind burns my face, and I sweat, wading through all this snow. But it's spring now, sounds of snow melting, water dripping off eaves, flooding crocuses and jack-in-the-pulpits, pussy willows, cattails, forsythia, suddenly awakened junipers tipped with pale new shoots. The wind flings pine cones my way. Now walking along the coast, I follow seagulls with my camera. Seagulls skimming waves, and I focus on their bills in the foaming water. They dip their bills, I focus, they rise with limp silver, flashing in the sun. As others come swooping down, I turn circling with my camera, while waves rise and crash upon rocks, flinging salty seaweed and mollusks, chipping seashells upon cliffs. Waves crash and leave small pools of fish stranded. Orpheus, I want to stay here with the smooth pebbles. I want to stay here at the ocean's edge. I have found someone new, no God, but a quiet man who listens.
Okay, great. I think that gives everyone, including me, something to be really looking forward to. That is poems, new poems, inspired by Dessau, your memories, and all of the narratives you might encounter there. Maybe one last question, because I know we've talked about this while we were both still in Dessau, walking around the master's houses and among the pine trees. No sea, unfortunately, unlike in Maine, but pine trees still. But something that came up and something that is really prominent, I think, in all of your work are the links to the visual culture, to paintings in particular. Now, you do have a studio actually in that house, and lots of famous painters lived in these master houses in the 1920s, including Paul Klee. And I think you've discovered him a little bit for yourself, right?
Yes, that's right. I've always admired Paul Klee's work, and after living in the Mucha house, and unfortunately I could only see part of the Klee house because the top floor was blocked due to repainting, but hopefully later, once we are free to move around again, I can visit the rest of the house. But I've read more about his work and his life, and I've also looked at more of his paintings. Although I've always over the years seen much of his work in various museums, but now I feel a closer connection to him because of my residency at the Bauhaus, and so I am focusing a little more on Paul Klee and his ideas about color, and well, he was also a musician, and he wrote poems, and he was interested in the motion within a painting, which is so true and so difficult to achieve as someone who is a viewer and a very I would say keen observer of of nature, but also of art. It's true. There are times when something is so perfect in a painting, and you can't always put your finger on it, but it also has to do with the space and the motion, even though the painting is not in motion. But as Paul Klee reminds us, it's the way the eyes move across a painting that gives it the motion.
Well, I'm intrigued already, and I think we're all hoping to get back to the master's houses and to Dessau and to the residency program as soon as possible. Also, I think we should mention that, you just talked about space and how space is important in Klee, but actually in all of the Bauhaus works. Something quite unusual with the residency program is, of course, that we bring together a writer and a visual artist, a sculptor in this case, and we will be putting together an exhibition in a space with your new work, the poems, the texts, and a new work by Inge Mahn. So you're looking at the space in Paul Klee, while at the same time, we'll actually try to put text into a spatial context. So I think there are quite a few really interesting things going on, and I think really something to be looking forward to. So everyone stay tuned for the residency program, and be well through the corona pandemic, and hopefully talk to you, see you, listen to you all soon. Thank you. And thank you to the Literaturhaus again. Thank you, Sujata.
Yes. Thank you, Florian. Thank you, Sonja and Martin. And thank you to the Literaturhaus for providing this space and time. And of course, to the Bauhaus.